Hello everyone, welcome to this week's PoE2 trade report. Before we dive into the specific details of the trade report and look at the specific items, I thought I'd let you know a couple of small changes that I made to this week's report. The first one is the use of the measurement called median. So it's very comparable with the average, but it basically takes in account outliers. The second point I wanted to highlight is the maturity of the data that I use for the PoE2 trade report. So the data that I'm using is not older than 3 days. Another thing I wanted to call out is peak hours. So there's periods during the week that there is a higher volume of trading happening in Path of Exile 2. This is likely during the evenings and in the weekend. During these times, there is likely a higher demand for your trades. The fourth item I wanted to cover is the item level. So the item level of the items that you have up for trade is important. A lot of people are looking for a specific item level because certain modifiers only become available at certain item levels. As an example, let's look at a scepter. For my Infernalist, I'm looking for a scepter with +5 level to minion skills, and this only becomes available for scepters with item level 81 or up. I also wanted to mention a weird phenomenon that I noticed when the server was reset for maintenance. This happened on Wednesday this week and on Thursday actually, because Wednesday fell apart. Yesterday, Thursday, I was actually preparing this report. So I was looking at the trade data and it actually had some really weird behavior right after the server was reset. It can be because the server reset triggers sort of a batch process that runs for a while to basically update all the outstanding trades. I'm not sure about that, but I thought I'd let you know. So there is some kind of weird correlation between a server reset and the available trades on PoE2 trade. Before we start, I also wanted to highlight 2 tips that were given by commenters on previous week's video. The first one is about fractional pricing. One of the commenters said that you can actually put items up for a fraction of a divine. So let's look at that. So I have 3 belts here that I basically want to bundle as a trade for 1 divine. So I can basically put it up for an exact price of 1/3 of a divine orb. And I can do that for all 3. And it will show as it's up for 1/3 of a divine. So technically, if you sell these 3 belts as a bundle, you can get 1 divine for it. That's basically the pricing that it's put up for. You can also put a period in your pricing. So for 1/3, it would be somewhere around 0.33 for a divine orb. That basically works as well. So this is fractional pricing. There is a caveat here. I tried this earlier today and I tried to find back my items on PoE2 trade and I was not able to. So even though it works in the game, I'm not exactly sure where this will show up and if it will show up. So that's something to take in account. The second tip provided by one of the commenters on previous week's video is using the trade chat in the game instead of using the PoE2 trade website and your stash tab. So one of the things you can do is actually go to your chat windows. There is a little tab across all the different tabs that basically says trade. This chat is basically being used by people that are trying to sell or buy stuff. I personally don't really use this. It creates a lot of noise, which I find annoying while I'm playing. But if this is something you can deal with and you don't mind, then this is obviously an option for you. And you can basically use it to broadcast if you want to buy something or if you're looking for something or if you want to sell something. Totally up to you. I want to thank both commenters and all the other commenters on previous week's video. Okay, so that's it for setting the stage of this week's report. Let's have a look at the details. So we'll start with the Sapphire ring, same as last week. I think the only thing I want to call out different from last week's report is that I used a sample size of 100. So let's look at the details. We'll just scroll down and we will see the data set for both the Exalted and the Divine. So as you can see, there's a couple of high values in the Exalted side of things. We have a 200 here, a 280, which is the highest one, 150. But the majority of the values is somewhere between 40 and 70. So the values are actually fairly stable from an Exalted perspective. From a Divine perspective, I think we're seeing the same, but obviously with very different values. We have an outlier of 100 here, which I think is also immediately the highest. And then we see the majority of values on the divine side to be 1. So when we look at the calculation, we basically see a couple of things. Let's look at the Exalted first. So the median on the Exalted side is 50. And the average on the Exalted side is 53. So you see that those are very, very close to each other. That means that the number of outliers in the dataset for Exalted is fairly small. However, we still see a maximum outlier of 280 and a minimum outlier of 2. So there is for sure outliers. When we look at the divine side of things on the Sapphire, for the Sapphire ring, we see that the median is 1 and that the average is 3.5. When you think about this from a divine perspective, that's obviously quite significant. The maximum offer is up for 100 divines and the minimum offer is up for 1. As you just saw in the dataset, the majority of offers is up for 1. That basically means that if I would put my Sapphire ring up for a divine orb, I would put it up for 1. The candlestick graphs actually represent what we just discussed for both the Exalted offers and the divine offers. When we look at the weekly supply trend, we see a small increase on both the Exalted offers and the divine offers. However, what is interesting to see in this graph is that there is actually more Sapphire rings up for trade for divines as there is for Exalted orbs. That's slightly unexpected. That's it for the Sapphire rings. Let's jump to the gold ring. We'll do the same thing for the gold ring. So let's look at the data for the gold ring for Exalted offers and for divine offers. So the first thing, when we look at the Exalted side, we have obviously here an outlier of 400, which is significant. That's a big outlier. But we also have a person that put gold rings up for 100, about 10. There's also quite a lot of values between 300 and 100. So the interesting thing here is that I think these numbers are fairly inflated and actually on the high end. So let's look at the divine. I think from a divine side, we see more or less the same as we just saw on the Sapphire ring. Most divine offers are up for 1 divine. So let's look at the calculations. When we look at the Exalted, the median is 50, which I think is a reasonable price for a gold ring. The average is 70, so you already see a bigger difference between the median and the average here. The maximum value is up for 400, the minimum value is up for 100, so that's what we just saw. However, this data set shows a significant amount of outliers on the high end, and that obviously influences the average. On the divine side of things, I think the conversation is easy. I think anything above 1 divine, you put yourself out of the market. When we look at the candlestick graphs, you actually see the fact that there is more outliers on the Exalted side. If I would put my gold ring up for sale, I would probably still put it up for around 50 Exalted orbs. The divine side is, as I said, it's the same as what we just saw on the Sapphire ring. I think the only viable option to put your gold ring up for sale is 1 divine. Looking at the weekly supply trend, we see a small increase on offers up for a divine. We see a small decrease, a very small decrease on offers being up for Exalted orbs. That's it for the gold ring. Let's have a look at the breach ring. Let's have a look at the detailed data for the breach ring. This one is interesting because we obviously immediately see that somebody dumped a high number of rings for a very high value, being 400. Here's a small pool of 100. So the fact that somebody put 28 breach rings up for 400, which is immediately the highest value, will obviously have an impact on the average. Looking at the divines, I think it's fairly similar to what we see for the Sapphire ring and for the gold ring. So the majority of people that put their breach ring up for a divine orb put it up for 1. Let's have a look at the calculations. On the Exalted orb side, we see a median of 60, which is actually slightly higher from what we saw on the Sapphire ring and the gold ring. I think this is mainly driven by the fact that we see sort of an inflated data set because of the person putting the ring up for 400 Exalted orbs. That also drives the average. So we're looking at an average of about 150 for the breach ring, which is obviously very, very high. The maximum that we already saw is 400 and the minimum is 1 Exalted orb. I actually sold a number of breach rings this week and I sold them for 50 Exalted orbs. I think that's probably a good price to go with. Let's have a look at the graphs. You can already see that because of the person putting 28 breach rings up for 400, the candlestick graph is more or less messed up. So there's so many outliers that it's not being looked at as an outlier anymore. I think on the divine side, It's exactly like with the Sapphire ring and the gold ring. I would put my breach ring up for 1 divine if I would put my breach ring up for a divine, which I don't. Looking at the weekly supply trend for the breach ring, we see that it's very stable. I do want to say that the amount of breach rings being put up for trade is significant. So there's a high supply. I think there's also a fairly high demand. That's it for the breach ring. Let's have a look at the Stellar Amulet. So the Stellar Amulet is an interesting item, and I think it's also the highest value item in the list of items that we cover in this report. So let's have a look at the detailed data on both the Exalted and the Divine side. As you can see, the numbers of Exalted orbs are significantly higher than what we saw on the rings. So we have an outlier of 600, an outlier of 599, but numbers like 500 are seen as average. So they are not considered low, but also not considered high. So like I said, the value of a Stellar Amulet converted in Exalted is significant. When we look at Divines, we actually see a lot less Stellar Amulets being put up for 1. So people are putting their Stellar Amulets up for more than 1 Divine. We obviously have a person that put up a number of Stellar Amulets for 78. Good luck with that. But it's for sure not the highest. We actually have an outlier of 450, which is obviously a clear outlier and also the highest value. So let's look at the calculation. Let's first look at the Exalteds. So the median is 500. What we obviously see is that the number of Stellar Amulets in a dataset of 100 put up for 500 is significant. You also see the average being very close to that number. So the median and the average are not far off. The maximum value the Stellar Amulet is being put up for Exalted Orbs is 600 and the minimum is 111. When we look at Divines, the median is 2, with an average being about 21, which is obviously driven by the fact that there is a small couple of outliers that one person put it up for 450. I think the other one was a number of offers being put up for 78, which obviously drives up the average. I think the average is not representative for what your Stellar Amulet is worth from a Divine perspective. So what I would do, if I would have a Stellar Amulet and I would sell it for Exalted Orbs, I would probably put it up for around 500. I would try it. And if I would put it up for a Divine, I've sold Stellar Amulets for 1 and they sold fairly quickly. You can try 2. I've tried 2. I was not very successful with that, but I was a bit impatient. So it's up to you. The median is 2, so you can actually try it. If you just want to bank quickly, you should put it up for 1. When we look at the weekly supply trend for Stellar Amulets, from an Exalted Orb perspective, it's very stable. It's basically exactly the same as I measured it last week. The supply is actually increasing from a Divine perspective. That's it for the Stellar Amulets. Let's look at the next one, which is the Heavy Belt. So the Heavy Belt is interesting. I have the feeling that the demand for the Heavy Belt is very volatile. So one moment there's a high demand, in the other moment you can put them up for sale and then nothing happens for a couple of days. So let's have a look at the details. Let's look at the Exalted Orbs first. So you immediately start with an outlier, and I think it's probably the highest value, with a Heavy Belt being put up for 400 Exalted Orbs. Then we have a lot of values that range somewhere between 50 and 20, 15. Then we have a couple of higher values. We have basically anything ranging from 100 to 300, which are still considered outliers. Then we have a couple of very low values, 1 Exalted, 5 Exalted, and then we have a whole range of around 20. When we look at the Divines, this is interesting, right? I've not been successful selling a Heavy Belt for a Divine Orb, but there's quite a lot of people still trying. So as we saw with the rings, I think most Heavy Belts are being put up for 1 Divine. You see that with the green values in the Divine column, which is predominantly 1. You actually have a large section of 5s here, which is probably a person that dumped a whole bunch of Heavy Belts for 5 Divines in his trading tab. So let's have a look at the calculation. When we look at the Exalted Orbs, we see a median of around 20. Which I think is probably the price that you want to go for when you put your Heavy Belt up for Exalted Orbs. The average is 61. I think that's too high for Heavy Belts, and you're probably not going to be successful selling your Heavy Belt for that price. We already saw, I think it was the second value, the maximum value that a Heavy Belt was put up for was 400, and then the lowest value is 1. When we look at the Divine side, I think it's fairly similar and very simple as what we discussed with the rings. I think if you want to try and sell your Heavy Belt for a Divine, you probably want to put it up for 1 Divine. Anything above that, the likelihood of being successful selling your Heavy Belt is very low. So let's look at the graphs. On the Exalted side, the candlestick graph basically says what we just said, right? I would still go on the lower end of that. So again, I will probably put my heavy belt up for around 20. Divines, as said, I think the only viable option for putting your heavy belt up for a divine is 1. And I think the chance of success is still very low. We also see this in the weekly supply trend. From a divine perspective, the offers are stable, but you can see that it is significantly less belts being put up for divines compared to Exalted Orbs. We actually saw a decrease in the amount of offers being put up for Exalted Orbs though. That's it for the heavy belt. Let's have a look at the Attuned Wand. Before we jump into the Attuned Wand, I think this is one of the items where the item level is more important. I have the feeling I'm more successful selling Attuned Wands and Siphoning Wands when they're higher than item level 81. So let's have a look at the data for the Attuned Wand from an Exalted perspective and from a Divine perspective. So the first thing when we scroll through the Exalted values is that we see an outlier of 250. So there's a couple of high values here. We see 250, we see 150, 100, we have a couple of 163, 133, and then we have a couple of, let's say, average values and lower values. We have a couple up for 1. Again, a couple of high ones. We have 1 for 100, 2 for 200, 3 for 200. We have 1 for 300, which I believe is also immediately the highest value. Yeah, which is correct. So let's have a look at the Divine Orbs. So I think the majority, what we will see is that most Attuned Wands will be up for 1 Divine. Again, there is, a person that put up a significant amount of Attuned Wands for 100 Divines, which is, I honestly don't fully understand why people do that, because the chance of successfully selling them, I think, is 0. So I don't understand why this happens, but yeah, we have to deal with that, so that's what it is. A couple of 1s, a couple of 40s, which is obviously extremely high, another 100. So those are the details. So let's have a look at the calculation and start with the Exalted Orbs. So the median for the Exalted Orbs is 20, with an average of 45. The difference between the median and the average is obviously driven by the fact that we saw a large group of very high values. The maximum value being 300 that we see on the screen here, and then the minimum value being 1. On the Divine side of things, we see a median of 2, which I think is already on the high side. The average is actually around 30, which is obviously outrageous. We know that there is a person that dumped a significant amount of Attuned Wands for 100 Divines, which is why we're probably seeing this average being so high. It's also the maximum value that is reported in the dataset, and the minimum value is 1. Let's look at the candlestick chart. You can already see that the candlestick chart for the Divine Orb offers is messed up by the fact that somebody put up so many offers for 100. But let's start with the Exalted first. The Exalted candlestick chart basically tells us that the range is somewhere between 10 to 50. Which I think is correct. I would put my Attuned Wand probably up for 25 or 30 Exalted Orbs. I think the supply of these is fairly high, and we see that there is actually an increase in the supply. So that's probably a good price to go with. If you have time and you're patient, you can obviously try and sell them for more, but I think 25 to 30 is probably good. When we look at the Divine side of things, I think the data set was basically messed up by the person who dumped so many Attuned Wands for 100. If you want to sell your Attuned Wand for a Divine, as with some of the other items we just discussed, I would put it up for 1. I think anything above 1, you put yourself out of the market immediately, and I think it's already going to be difficult to sell your Attuned Wand for 1 Divine. When we look at the weekly supply trend, we see a slight increase of offers being put up for Divines, and we see a slightly higher increase for the offers being put up for Exalted Orbs. That's it for the Attuned Wands. Let's look at the last one, which is the Siphoning Wand. When we look at the Exalted side, we see quite a lot of items being put up for 100. So we're probably dealing with a person that had 10 or 15 Siphoning Wands in his stash and thought, okay, I'll put them up for a good price. We actually see the second batch here. We have one outlier of 600, which is obviously outrageous, and actually another one for a Siphoning Wand. We see quite a lot of offers of 10, 20, some lower ones of 1 and 2. And then, like I said, there's a couple of 600s, which good luck selling your Siphoning Wand for 600 Exalted Orbs. But there's clearly people that think that's a viable number. So when we look at the Divine side of offers, I think it's fairly stable. You see the offers being put up the most is 1. There's here a couple of 15, a couple of 2s, a couple more 2s. Then we have one outlier of 100, which is obviously a bit of a weird number. And I don't think anybody will put down 100 divines for a regular siphoning wand. So let's have a look at the calculation. Let's look at the Exalted first. The median for the Exalted offers is 50, with the average being 72, nearly 73. So you see a bit of a difference between the median and the average, which we saw in some of the previous items as well, which is obviously driven by the outliers. I think 50 as a median for your siphoning wand is already on the high side. I would probably choose a similar price as I would ask for my Attuned wands, which is somewhere between 25 and 35 Exalted orbs. As you saw, the high side of Exalted offers is 600. I think we had 3 in the dataset. And then the lower side, the minimum is 1. When we look at the siphoning wand and the divine offers, the median is 1. And again, I think the only viable option is to put your siphoning wand up for 1 divine if you want to go the divine route. Anything higher than that, I think you put yourself out of the market. Okay, let's have a look at the graphs. The Exalted Orb range says it should be somewhere between 14 and 100. I think that's way too high. I think, again, if you put your siphoning wand up, I would probably stick with what I just said for the Attuned wands. I would probably put it up for somewhere between 25 and 35 Exalted Orbs. And I think you have a good chance of selling your siphoning wands fairly quickly at that price. Talking about item level 81 or higher. Looking at the weekly supply trend for siphoning wands, you see an increase, especially a steep increase of offers being put up for Exalted Orbs. Divine, simple, as with some of the other items. I think the only viable option is 1 divine. Anything above 1 divine, you put yourself out of the market. And yeah, that's it. I think the other thing is that we see a small increase in offers being put up for divines, but it's not very steep. It's not as steep as the offers being put up for Exalteds. Okay, that is it. I think we covered all the items. Please let me know what you think. I appreciate your feedback. If you have any ideas or any thoughts, any questions, please drop them in the comment section down below. The other thing is, if there's items that I should be tracking, let me know. These are the ones that I typically find and try to sell for either Exalteds or for divines. In most cases, Exalteds, as you just heard. Let me know as well. I can have a look and incorporate them. Thank you for watching, and I either see you in my weekly live stream that I do on Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, or I'll see you in next week's PoE2 Trade Report. Bye.